Greetings and welcome to Mr. Campbell's Global 10 class. We're actually starting Unit 2, which involves the Industrial Revolution and European imperialism. We're in Section 1, Part A, the Agrarian Revolution, and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which is a large unit that takes place over several sets of notes. Our self-test questions are big ideas here. What changes occurred during the Agrarian or Agricultural Revolution? List and describe the factors of production. Give an example of how Great Britain possessed an advantage in each of these. What factors caused the Industrial Revolution to begin in Great Britain? And what role did technology play in the Industrial Revolution? And what were the effects of these new technologies? To understand the Industrial Revolution, we have to get to the bottom of this Agrarian Revolution. From about the 1700s till the 1850s, really the changes lasting all the way into the early 1900s as well. So it's got two major names, the Agrarian Revolution or the 18th century Agricultural Revolution, sometimes called the British or the English Agricultural Revolution as well. And it's a series, not one thing, but a series of changes in technology, farming, land use, and business practices occurring in Great Britain in the 1700s. And just kind of as a caveat here, Great Britain is formed from England, Scotland, and Wales together in an Act of Union, 1707. So it's no longer England and these other kingdoms. They unify the kingdoms together, and as well as Ireland, and create Great Britain, which will be a main thing we'll talk about really for the rest of the year, is this empire of Britannia or Great Britain. The changes of the Agrarian Revolution, all these changes eventually spread all over Europe and eventually to other nations as well. But they spread first to Europe, which will give Europe an economic advantage for the next century and a half. And most of these changes we're talking about, you do see into the world today. So it's a very easy thing to talk about this as an enduring issue. This is changes in technology. It's a clash between tradition and modernization. It is innovation. It is interactions with environment or impact of geography. There's a lot going on here for an enduring issue. So we have a little passage here. What were two changes of the methods of food production that occurred during the Agricultural Revolution, according to the authors of History of a Modern World? The English Revolution of 1688, confirming the ascendancy of Parliament over the king, meant in economic terms the ascendancy of the more well-to-do property-owning classes. Amongst these were the landowners by far the most important, though they counted the great London merchants among their allies. For a century and a half, from 1688 to 1832, the British government was substantially in the hands of these landowners, the squirearchy, or gentlemen of England. The result was a thorough transformation of farming, an agricultural revolution, without which the Industrial Revolution could not have occurred. Many landowners seeking to increase their money incomes began experimenting with improved methods of cultivation and stock raising. They made more use of fertilizers, mainly animal manure. They introduced new implements such as the seed drill and horse hoe, and they brought in new crops such as turnips and a more scientific system of crop rotation. They attempted to breed larger sheep and fatter cattle. And improving landlord to introduce such changes successfully needed full control over his land. He saw a mere barrier to progress in the old village system of open fields, common lands, and semi-collective methods of cultivation. Improvement also required an investment of capital, which was impossible so long as the soil was tilled by numerous poor and custom-bound farmers. So we see here all sorts of stuff. We've got these new implements, we've got use of fertilizers, we've got technology, new machines, we've got the control over the land, we have new types of crops, all sorts of answers are in here. And we've got another one of our dwarf pictures, which the Regents loves. You have that scientific breeding, crop rotation, agricultural machinery. So we're seeing industrialization here. We have artificial fertilizers. These are all the new and improved quality and greater yields of farm products. So let's take a deep varieties. Crop rotation, one of the huge changes of this British industrial or agricultural revolution. Before, you had the medieval system, right? That had been around since around the 11th century, or the year 1000. It's three-field crop rotation. You have your wheat and barley, and then you lie that land fallow. You allow your farm animals to kind of eat whatever weeds or grass grow, and they crap in the land, and then their hooves kind of dig the crap into the land, fertilizing, right, the manure. And then you'd plant whatever vegetables you could get. Carrots, cabbage was a common one. And the idea here is you leave a field empty or fallow. That's this one. This only the cows are eating there, but effectively it's not really getting used to produce food. And the goal here is to rejuvenate the soil. Well, in this new crop rotation system, this is called four-field system of crop rotation, you had crops growing year-round. This required newer foods from the New World, from that Columbian exchange. And what this did is it's allowed plants like clover and turnips that can rejuvenate the soil or do not tax the soil to be grown. And clover is phenomenal. It has nitrogen-fixing bacteria in its root system, so it'll actually help improve soil quality. And then you can dry clover and feed it to horses. So you're growing food for horses or cattle or whatever farm animals you have, and you're making the soil better as well. So an effect of this crop rotation will be to increase food supply. And as we know, whenever we increase food supply, we are also increasing or potentially increasing the population. So keep that in mind. We have the enclosure system. The enclosure system is actually one of the more fascinating ones to me, though it's kind of can get a little weird to wrap your head around. So in this agricultural revolution, British landlords start to buy up or literally like force farmers off their land. You got to remember, the farmers back then, a lot of them didn't own the land. They were tenant farmers. So they rented land from the landlords, from the wealthy people, and they also did live in houses on that land. So they're like renting the land, they're farming, they give most of the food they grow to the landlords, and they get to keep a little for themselves. Well, having all these poor farmers doing subsistence agriculture isn't super effective if you're trying to raise money, if you're trying to industrialize agriculture. So what you see is the development of a more strict landlord system in Great Britain. They begin to enclose the field. So enclosures are another adaptation or innovation of this time period. They start to wall these fields up into these separate segments, and they start to basically kick the tenant farmers off the land. Now, the benefits to Great Britain as a whole is it allows them more productive harvesting. They know exactly what's going on in any given field. The landlords are controlling what's being grown. They're controlling the crop rotation, not leaving it to the farmers, the poor peasants, really. And they can experiment. They can say, okay, I'm using special new tools in this field. Did I actually grow more grain? Was that effective? So this enclosure system of having all these separated fields does allow them to be more productive. They also tended to enclose common lands. Common lands are a throwback to the medieval time period, but it had endured into the 1700s. This idea that every village has common land that is usable in some manner by everyone. You can't plant wheat and barley there, but you can have your animals pasture there. You might be able to collect firewood from there, and all sorts of other things. And the landlords either drive people off of this or they buy it. And so what you see is almost a mini forced migration. And this is a famous painting, and there's a great song here of the Highland clearances, where British landlords go into Scotland and they literally drive off all the peasant families from their land, saying, well, you don't own this. I technically own this land. And if you want to buy it, if you have, a couple $1,000s, sure, you can buy land. Oh, you don't? Well, then get off of my land, and I will hire you to farm it, but we're no longer going to have this kind of feudal relationship. And oftentimes, they would do things like offer the young men basically contracts to go fight in the military, especially in Scotland and in Ireland. They'd offer the young guys jobs in the military. They'd go become redcoats in the British Army. And then while the men were away, the landlords would come with some toughies, some ruffians, and they just start to burn down all the villages because it was only the women and elderly and young children left. So you might be able to call this a violation of human rights. It's tricky because technically, like, the landlords owned the land, but definitely it's a type of migration or forced migration and changes in population. Huge advantages are given and advances given in the area of technology and practice. You see incredible mechanization of agriculture, or the industrialization of farming in the sense. So machines are going to be used more and more, not just shovels and hoes, but actual geared machines. So some of the most famous ones from this time period is the seed drill. Jethro Tull's seed drill. Now, before, when you were planting wheat and barley for literally thousands of years, for most of human history, you did what was called broadcast seeding. The farmers had a bag of seeds, right? Even here in the 1800s, you have a guy doing it the old school way. This one's from the 11th century. And he walks around the field and he just throws the seed at the ground. And this is not particularly efficient. Some of this seed will not germinate properly. It'll be exposed too much to the sun. Some of it will be eaten by birds or mice or rats or really whatever's out there. So this seed drill was invented by a British landlord, and it poked little holes in the ground, placed a certain amount of seeds in there. It had a gear, so it did this every certain amount of inches, and then it had a little plow that would cover the seeds up. This is much more efficient, much more effective, and it boosted crop yields, or boosted the amount of food that was being produced substantially, and it led to less waste of these seeds. You also had other advantages like the heavy plow, the harrow, and the horse hoe. All of these allow for faster and deeper plowing. They increase the nutrients in the soil, and they also do this all faster, which means you're going to need fewer workers to get the same amount of farm production. One of the most impressive inventions of this time period was the mechanical thresher, which we think really the first one was invented around 1786. Threshing is a necessary process of farming. You have all this wheat that you harvest, but you don't have the actual wheat seeds that are what people eat. You have a lot of straw, basically useless stuff. You can only feed it to horses. So historically, what humans did is lay all the wheat on the ground, and they literally beat the wheat. They hit it with flails until the seeds were knocked loose, and then they swept the seeds up. This was about a quarter to 1/3 of all agricultural labor for, about 9,000 years. So very laborious. It takes about an hour to do but 1 bushel of wheat. The mechanical thresher, here it's driven by horses, could also be driven by hand. Later on, you'd see it driven by steam engines, stuff like that. That you just feed the wheat in, and it has gears and smashers in here that automatically thresh it and separate the wheat from the usable, the straw from the usable wheat, the part that humans actually eat. The problem with these is they're expensive to buy. So your average farmer, your average peasant, literally cannot afford to get these. It's only the rich landlords that can do that. And then this takes much less workers, many fewer workers to work. So the rich landlord buys this and then lays off a bunch of the workers that he no longer needs because he doesn't need as many people doing this process. So all of this is going to require or lead to really some job loss throughout Great Britain. Other practices that change: selective breeding. Farmers like Jethro Tull and others learn to breed the largest animals and most hardy of their animals with each other. They don't allow weaker or sicker or smaller animals to breed. They geld them, they fix them for all intents and purposes, and they really only breed the biggest ones. And the enclosure system helps with this because they can isolate the fertile breeding females they want to breed from the ones they do not want to breed, and only introduce the bulls, the larger ones, to the herds that they want to continue on the line. And what this does is double and eventually triple the size of food animals, radically increasing access to food in Great Britain. So what are our effects of this, right? Cause and effect. What does this do, this agricultural or agrarian revolution? Well, one of them is you have more food. Just every single one of these changes is increasing food. And that in turn leads to an increase in the population of England as the population just soars in these time periods. Incredible population growth. This increased population further leads to an increase in the demand for food. So by increasing the population, you need to make more food, which then increases the population, which then you need to make more food for. And as well as goods, clothes, everything really. These more humans need more stuff. This more efficient farming in the enclosures also had a negative effect of forcing poorer farmers and peasants off the land. Again, another famous painting. There's tons of these paintings of these enclosures, these forced migrations, or just migrations of these poorer farmers. So where do these people go? Well, they migrate to work in towns and eventually in factories. And that's why the Agrarian Revolution and the Industrial Revolution tie so well together. You have this growth in population. You need fewer agricultural workers. They go somewhere to find work. Well, where do they end up? They end up in these new towns and where there's new machinery, new factories, a new type of building. And there they find work. And so that's why you don't see these massive widespread famines too often in Great Britain. Ireland, yes, but we'll talk about that later, is because there is a place for them to go. They become then the factory workers. Another negative, arguably, of this is that land and wealth gets concentrated into the hands of fewer and fewer people. Like that passage we saw in the beginning, this squirearchy or this gentleman class in England gets phenomenally wealthy along with a merchant or middle trading class. And the poor, whether they're displaced rural workers, which is a great word to use, by the way, displaced, that means they have no place or their traditional place is gone. And it gets concentrated into the hands of these wealthy people. And so your agricultural workers either remain poor or they become poor factory workers. So there's a negative of this. So now we're going to turn our attention to the actual Industrial Revolution. It is a turning point in history. Please star that. That is más importante. The agricultural revolution is too, but definitely the industrial revolution. I mean, it's on every single region. It should be. If it's not, I would call into the question the validity of the regions itself. It is a fundamental change in the way goods were produced and the amount produced. So fundamental means at its most basic level, everything changes. It altered the way people lived. They're going to live more and more in towns and cities instead of the countryside. It changed the way they worked. More and more are going to work in factories, in towns, in cities. And they consumed. Instead of, like most of human history, most people never owned anything that was made more than 30 miles from their home. Instead, most people's everything will be made far, far from home and transported to them to stores or shops or what have you. And the Industrial Revolution begins, star the heck out of this, in Great Britain around the 1750s or the early 18th century. Why does the Industrial Revolution begin in Great Britain? Well, most historians would argue that Great Britain possessed certain advantages in the four factors of production. Land, which is both the resources, the actual land itself, resources like coal, and maybe advantages in geography. Specifically, we'll talk about the impact of like streams and rivers in Great Britain. They had advantages in labor. They had workers and humans that needed work. So they could immediately put these displaced agricultural workers, these farmers being kicked off the land, they could put them to work in factories. They had advantages in capital, which is both the money to invest in these new factories, in these new machines, and it's also the actual infrastructure that people work on. Like if you buy a mill, like a water mill, a water wheel, that is also kind of considered the infrastructure or capital as well. Today, capital would be like computers, the computer I'm working on now. And they had advantages in entrepreneurship. That's the desire to innovate, the desire to change things, the ability to organize and manage and take risks and run one's own business. They had a class of people, entrepreneurs, these kind of wealthy people who wanted to invest, who wanted to make money, who were willing to risk their money in new factories and new businesses, hoping that they'd make a profit. So they had all of these advantages. And you've got this other great chart that kind of explores these and adds a couple other ones as well. You got your geography, right? Your land. They have many harbors. They have rivers. They have a lot of coal, which powers these first steam-powered factories. And they're protected from invasion, right? Even during the horrors of the Napoleonic Wars, Great Britain didn't get invaded. They were one of the few European countries that didn't. They were close enough to European markets, right? They were right off the coast of France, that they could sell their goods to Europe. And they're an island nation, so they can also have, if they have a large fleet, which they did, they could trade with everywhere in the world. They had advantages in transportation and communication. This is kind of that idea of capital. They had coastal trade, canals, port towns, an excellent postal service, newspapers, and a powerful navy which could protect their trade interests by being like, yeah, no, don't attack our merchant ships or we'll go to war with you. They eventually would have a large colonial empire, which brought raw materials. We'll talk about this more kind of in our next unit. To ports like cotton to create new textiles. They had a powerful middle class. This is that wealthy gentleman class that participated in government and promoted this idea of free enterprise. They were able to bring in the money, bring in the capital, and come up with new industrial inventions. And they had the agricultural improvements of that revolution, the scientific methods of farming, rotating crops, animal breeding. Fewer people needed to work, which means those people could then work in industry. So all of this ties together. So let's look at land, how geographic factors helped promote industrialization. Please highlight or star that. That is a kind of key idea here. Definitely could see that on a CRQ, right? Geographic factors or geographic context. How is Great Britain benefiting, or how is industrialization happening in Great Britain first because of its geography? Well, one, Great Britain had huge reserves of coal and iron. So coal will eventually power the steam engines that are the driving force of this early industrial revolution. And iron is used to make tools, machines, and eventually steel, which becomes synonymous with the industrial revolution as well. Great Britain also had many fast-moving streams, which really the earliest machines weren't powered by steam yet. They were powered by water wheel. So these early industrial towns and factories had to be located near a river. And that also continues really for a couple hundred years. They also had a large coastline with a lot of those nice nooks and crannies to create natural harbors. And as an island nation, and kind of a smaller geographically island nation, no point in England is more than 70 miles from the coast. So it's not hard to get your trade products to the coast, to the port, to then sail wherever you want it to go. The streams allowed early water-powered machines. The streams also would provide water for our steam engines, which, as you know, a steam engine does require water. And the streams in the coast provide for the transport of goods. Labor. Great Britain had a large and growing population. Why? Because of that agrarian revolution in the 1700s. Their farms were more productive, which means that reduced the demand for actual farmers. We talked about this. These are the clearances, the land clearances, the enclosure system. So that leads to a surplus of workers because of this enclosure system. So they then migrate, these displaced agricultural workers migrate to the cities and towns to find work, providing a cheap source of labor. Because, you know, the whole idea of the Industrial Revolution is these people wanted to make a profit. And so you don't want to pay your workers a lot. So the farmers then become the factory workers. Capital. The British economy of the 1700s was relatively strong. Though they were driven pretty harshly into debt by the Napoleonic Wars, they bounced back pretty darn quick. And they also had a stable economic system. They're not overseeing this brutal inflation that some of the other countries are seeing, and they have a stable political culture. You know, after the English Civil War of the 1600s, there are no major wars on British soil. You have the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745, but that was crushed very, very quickly. And so you have political and economic stability. The kings pass, they have parliament in charge, parliament elects itself one generation after another. You have relatively seamless transitions of power from one parliament to another. So really a lot of political stability bolsters the capability to invest in this country. People aren't willing to invest in politically unstable areas because Great Britain is stable, more investment. They build this eventual huge empire, and that empire brings greater wealth to Great Britain. We'll talk about that more later. And Great Britain itself, like their actual government, they took money and they invested it in themselves. They built roads connecting huge segments of Great Britain. They built an interlocking canal system with locks so you could easily transport industrially produced goods across Great Britain or to port facilities, put them on a boat, and then trade them to Europe. And they built mines, railroads, all sorts of different stuff. They invested in themselves. British banking was advanced and had an excellent loan system. They created joint stock companies, and they even created an early stock market where, ownership in corporations, ownership in companies and factories could be sold, and that allowed them to raise more capital to build more factories. And what you'll see is eventually it becomes expensive to kind of pay these farmers because of, you're clearing them off the land. So the desire to reduce the cost of labor promotes industrialization. You don't want to pay as many workers, you want to have machines doing the work for you. And our last factor of production that Great Britain had advantages in is this concept of entrepreneurship. New systems of starting, running, and managing businesses. These British innovators, these British businessmen designed new machines to solve production problems or to improve their profits. So these British businessmen, these landowners, when they hear of a new invention, when they read of a new invention, they are very quick to adopt it. They're like, yeah, that sounds great. Let's get right on top of that. Some of these new technologies, of course, we talked about the seed drill and the thresher, water wheels being used more and more often in the 1700s to do labor. And then these are some of the biggest ones, so I want you to start. The flying shuttle or the flying shuttlecock and the spinning jenny. All of these were used, start in the textile or cloth industry. Initially wool, but very quickly becomes involved in cotton production. And eventually, of course, the steam engine itself. So one of these innovations, one of these, I dare say, technologies, or certainly new systems of the Industrial Revolution is the factory system. Please star that. Before factories, most goods were produced in homes. This is known as cottage industry or the domestic system. You'd have a shop owner or a business owner who would put out work. All right, they'd contract a variety of families in a local area and say, okay, you as a family are going to turn out cloth to me. All right, and they would work at home. You have the father usually working the actual loom because it required relatively a strong upper body to work this contraption here. And the girls and women of the household would spin the actual cloth or textile, or whatever it is, into the thread that the father would then use. Now, the problems with this system is this labor is unsupervised. Like the boss isn't here. The family's just working at their own pace. Some families are way better than others. So the quality of the goods you're getting is inconsistent. And to actually make like dresses or sails or whatever the British Empire needed or people wanted to buy, you had to have like a lot of these different families turning in cloth. You had difficulty in supply chains. This family isn't also making buttons. You have to go to a different family that makes buttons. They're not making ribbon. You have to go to a different family to make ribbon. To actually put out a dress required, 50, 60 different families to put together a couple dresses. And so the factory system first gets used in the textile or cloth making industry. That's the first to really develop this factory system. What you see is landowners and wealthy merchant class, they want to do away with this system. They want to supervise their workers. They want consistent quality, and they want easier access to supply chains. So this domestic system is going to go away. And instead, you're going to replace it with the factory system. Goods are produced in a central location, a factory. The workers and all the machines, the looms, the spinning stuff, all that is brought together into a single building owned by the manufacturer. So this is really our definition of what this factory system is. Its effects: it helps organize labor and materials to be more productive and have better quality control. The workers are being supervised by a boss. If they don't work hard enough, they get fired. So it's a much better way to organize your labor. Workers are employed. They get like an hourly wage instead of contracted. So you're able to more comfortably hire and fire them and manage their labor. And these buildings become huge. They become capable of not just turning out a couple bolts of cloth, but instead of mass production, making goods on a huge, large scale. And when you do this, the actual products you're buying become cheaper as well. These resources are bought in massive numbers, economies of scale. That's the idea that as the number of goods increases, the cost of producing each one is lowered. And so the end effect of that is goods are made cheaper, which the benefit of that is more people can have goods. Another element of industrialization, please star this one as well, is machination or mechanization. This is the process of using machines to produce goods. You have fewer workers needed to do the same work. And again, this is basically the definition of this concept. And this is a good one to keep in mind. It has been in several enduring issue essays so far. I've seen it on 2 out of the 3 regencies, this concept of mechanization or industrialization. And we have this phenomenal example right here. You have the spinning wheel. The spinning wheel was invented, we think, around 500 CE and was basically unchanged, for almost 2,000 years. And then all of a sudden, you have a woman, and she is spinning one thread at a time. In Great Britain, they invent this thing called the spinning jenny in 1764. And all of a sudden, still using human power, hand power, one woman is capable of spinning 12 threads. And then just 100 years later, you have these steam-powered spinners that are creating hundreds of threads, thousands of threads, and doing it much, much faster because they're powered by steam power. So again, faster production is the effect, which leads to cheaper goods. Also, we want to keep in mind that the nature of work is changing. All right, to work these type of equipment, these looms and stuff like that, it required skill. Factory work increasingly requires little to no skill. You can teach someone how to use one of these machines in an hour or two, maybe a day. It doesn't take years of watching your parents weave thread together to learn how to do it. It's all done by machine. So it creates a new social class. Star this, the unskilled laborer. And the problem with being an unskilled laborer is you're not really valued. They need you. They need you to work these machines. But because I can find a new you, I can teach a new person how to work these machines in the space of a couple hours. If you mess up, you're gone. If you get hurt, I don't care. I don't want to heal you or make sure you're okay so we can get you back to work. You're replaceable. And that's a very dangerous thing to be in the world, is easily replaced. This mechanization leads to machines developing at a faster and faster rate. As we can see, you have 2,000 years, the same equipment, and then in 100 years, you have massive changes. And many of these machines replaced human jobs, right? To make this, you would need 12 of these people. To make this, you would need 200 of these people. So you don't need as many people doing the same jobs. You also have an incredible change in power. This mechanization or industrialization of the process says that the nature of power itself, in terms of what we're going to use to run these things, changes. Instead of hand or animal power, it initially switches to water, the water wheel, and then to steam and coal, and eventually to electricity itself. One of the most important inventions, obviously, of this time period then is the steam engine. Initially invented by James Watt and Matthew Boulton, Watt gets a unit of power named after him. Bolton gets, well, nothing. They initially invented the steam engine to pump water out of mines. All right, mining is a very dangerous practice. Throughout human history, it's incredibly dangerous to mine, and mines flood, which means you cannot mine. Therefore, and they had created horse-powered pumps or just honestly human chains with buckets, but they needed something more reliable, more powerful, and that could work more consistently. So they invent the steam engine to do that. It's powered by coal, and basically how a steam engine works, because it might be a good idea to be able to explain this process, is you heat up, you have a heat source, right, coal-powered fire, and you have a chamber, usually made out of thick iron or steel, that has water in it. As the fire heats up the water, it vaporizes and expands, right? That's, water expands as it vaporizes. Steam itself. That steam pushes a piston, and if you have a dynamo right here, it rotates back in with the weight of whatever effort you have on the other side. So what are the advantages of this? Well, this is the main key technology of the Industrial Revolution, upon which the revolution becomes truly revolutionary. Powered by coal, which means coal is going to be a necessary resource. It is the oil of, the industrial society, that everyone needed coal. Coal. Industrial machinery, steam-powered machinery, is more powerful than animals or humans. It is capable of much greater force generation. So you can do things like fold steel or iron that a human can't really do without heating it and hammering it like a blacksmith. Well, the machines are capable of much greater force. Steam engines don't really become fatigued or tired. You do have to repair them and do maintenance on them, but they can go for much longer than a human can. They are faster than humans, and they can be used to power all sorts of other stuff, not just machinery, but later trains, and they overall increase productivity. I would like to also point out here that most of the power produced in the world today is still technically produced by steam engines. All right? You have coal-powered plants. They basically use coal to heat up water to go through a steam turbine to generate electricity. Even nuclear reactors, right? You think of nuclear power. Nuclear power, instead of using coal, you're using nuclear energy. But how you're actually producing the electricity is still a steam engine. You are heating up water using nuclear power, using fission, and that heated up water is going to go through a steam turbine to generate electricity. So this is still the main method whereby our entire world is powered. And that's an easy way to show continuity and change, that the methods of steam engines might have changed. They are now using nuclear power, but the idea that steam itself, vaporized water, creates power is still the basis of our entire world today. There are some very strong reactions to mechanization, specifically from workers. Many workers in Great Britain felt threatened by industrialization and mechanization. And these fall into two major groups. One were called the Luddites. Luddites were textile workers and kind of early industrial workers who smashed up machinery. They'd go inside factories and they'd break this stuff up because they're taking their jobs, right? South Park, they took their jobs. Well, they were, this machine could do the work of 20 people. So why do you need 20 people when you could have one work the machine? And of course, they were violently put down and arrested by the government. You had the swing riots, or Captain Swing riots of the 1830s, as the mechanical threshers took over and were replacing and displacing all these agricultural workers. You saw these riots of farmers smashing up mechanical threshers and burning down this farm machinery because it was replacing them and they were getting kicked off the land. Both of these movements were violently put down by the British military. And you got to think back to that first document we looked at. The British government is controlled by the wealthy landowning class and this merchant or capitalist class. So when their capital, when their machines are in danger, they're the ones also like in parliament writing the laws or voting in parliament. So they're like, yeah, British military, there's a bunch of people smashing machinery, arrest them, kill them, and hang them as criminals to the state. And they did. So, as much as you saw a violent reaction against this, it arguably is not very effective, though people try. So, to sum this all up, new agricultural methods of the agricultural revolution led to population increases in Europe, starting in Great Britain. New technologies develop increasingly rapidly, so increasingly fast. The rate of technology grows. That is something we still experience to this day, that the rate of technology is always increasing. Production changes. This is a big one. Star it. From hand tools to complex machines. That is a huge element of the Industrial Revolution. Power changes from human and animal powered to water and eventually steam. The effects of these two things are that production increases and society, starting in Great Britain, spreading throughout Europe and to the Americas, society itself changes very, very rapidly. The Industrial Revolution that begins in Great Britain spreads to Belgium, France, Germany, pretty much all of Western Europe, and the United States, and eventually Japan. And it dawns a new era in human history. Thanks for joining me.